live? I think we're live. Hopefully we're live. Well, we're going to assume that we are. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another live reading from Virus Free Radio. I am your host, James, and tonight we will be continuing our reading of Bram Stoker's Dracula. As always, I'm accompanied by our lovely minstrel, Ryan, to take us on our journey into Bram Stoker's vision of horror. As a quick recap, we will be taking up the story from where we left off. Van Helsing has gathered his motley crew together of Arthur, the new lord of the manor that inherited from his father, and would-be husband to the now former, to the late Lucy Wainstra, although not quite late enough for Van Helsing's liking. Our Texan Quincy, stout fellow that he is, and Dr. Seward, all will be coming along with Van Helsing to investigate Miss Lucy's tomb and to see what lies within. So without further ado, we will be pressing forward into Bram Stoker's Dracula, Chapter 16. Dr. Seward's Diary. Continued. It was just a quarter before 12 o'clock when we got into the churchyard over the low wall. The night was dark, with occasional gleams of moonlight between the rents of the heavy clouds that exceeded across the sky. We all kept somehow close together, with Van Helsing slightly in front as he led the way. When we had come close to the tomb, I looked well at Arthur, for I feared that the proximity to a place laden with so sorrowful a memory would upset him, but he bore himself well. I took it that the very mystery of the proceeding was in some way a counteractant to his grief. The professor unlocked the door, and seeing a natural hesitation amongst us for various reasons, solved the difficulty by entering first himself. The rest of us followed, and he closed the door. He then lit a dark lantern and pointed to the coffin. Arthur stepped forward, hesitatingly. Van Helsing said to me, "You were with me here yesterday. Was the body of Miss Lucy in the coffin?" It was. The professor turned to the rest, saying, "You hear? And yet there is no one who does not believe with me." He took his screwdriver and again took the lid off the coffin. Arthur looked on, very pale but silent. When the lid was removed, he stepped forward. He evidently did not know that there was a leaden coffin, or at any rate had not thought of it. When he saw the rent in the lead, the blood rushed to his face for an instant, but as quickly it fell away again, so that he remained of a ghastly witness. He was still silent. Van Helsing forced back the leaden flange, and we all looked in and recoiled. The coffin was empty. For several minutes no one spoke a word. The silence was broken by Quincy Morris. "Professor, I answered for you. Your word is all I want. I wouldn't ask such a thing ordinarily. I wouldn't dishonor you as to imply a doubt, but this is a mystery that goes beyond any honor or dishonor. Is this your doing? I swear to you by all that I hold sacred that I have not removed nor touched her. What happened was this. 2 nights ago, my friend Seward and I came here, with good purpose, believe me. I opened that coffin, which was then sealed up, and we found it, as now, empty. We then waited, and saw something white come through the trees. The next day, we came here in the daytime, and she lay there. Did she not, friend John?" "Yes." "That night, we were just in time. One more so small child was missing, and we find it, thank God, unharmed amongst the graves. Yesterday, I came here before sundown, for at sundown, the undead can move. I waited here all the night till the sun rose, but I saw nothing. It was most probable that it was because I had laid over the clamps of those doors with garlic, which the undead cannot bear, and other things which they shun. Last night there was no exodus, so tonight, before the sundown, I took away my garlic and other things, and so it is we find this coffin empty. But bear with me. So far there is much that is strange. Wait you with me outside, unseen and unheard, and things much stranger are yet to be. So, here he shut the dark slide of his lantern, now to the outside. He opened the door, and we filed out, he coming last and locking the door behind him. Oh, but it seemed fresh and pure in the night air after the terror of that vault. How sweet it was to see the clouds race by, and the passing gleams of the moonlight between the succeeding clouds crossing and passing, like the gladness and sorrow of a man's life. How sweet it was to breathe the fresh air that had no taint of death and decay. How humanizing to see the red lighting of the sky beyond the hill, and to hear far away the muffled roar that marks the life of a great city. Each in his own way was solemn and overcome. Arthur was silent, and was, I could see, striving to grasp the purpose and the inner meaning of the mystery. I was myself tolerably patient, and half inclined again to throw aside doubt and to accept Van Helsing's conclusions. Quincey Morris was phlegmatic in the way of a man who accepts all things, and accepts them in the spirit of cool bravery, with hazard of all he has to stake. Not being able to smoke, he cut himself a good-sized plug of tobacco and began to chew. As to Van Helsing, he was employed in a definite way. First, he took from his bag a mass of what looked like thin, wafer-like biscuit, which was carefully rolled up in a white napkin. Next, he took out a double handful of some whitish stuff, like dough or putty. He crumbled the wafer up fine and worked it into the mass between his hands. This he then took, and rolling it into thin strips, began to lay them into the crevices between the door and its setting in the tomb. I was somewhat puzzled by this, and being close, asked him what it was he was doing. Arthur and Quincey drew near also, as they were too curious. He answered, I am closing the tomb so that the undead may not enter. And is this stuff you have to put there going to do it? Asked Quincey. Great Scott, what is this, a game? It is. What is it you are using? This time the question was by Arthur. Van Helsing reverently lifted his hat as he answered. The host. I brought it from Amsterdam. I have an indulgence. It was an answer that appalled the most skeptical of us, and we felt individually that in the presence of such earnest purpose as the professor's, a purpose which could thus use him of the most sacred of things, it was impossible to distrust. In respectful silence, we took the places assigned to us close around the tomb, but hidden from the sight of anyone approaching. I pitied the others, especially Arthur. I had myself been apprehensed by my former visits to this watching horror, and yet I, who had up to an hour ago repudiated the proofs, felt my heart sink within me. Never did tombs look so ghastly white. Never did cypress or yew or juniper seem so the embodiment of funeral gloom. Never did tree or grass wave or rustle so ominously. Never did bow creak so mysteriously, and never did the far-away howling of dogs send such a woeful feeling through the night. There was a long spell of silence, a big aching void, and then, from the professor, a keen hiss. He pointed, and far down the avenue of yews we saw a white figure advance, a dim white figure, which held something dark at its breast. The figure stopped, and at the moment a ray of moonlight fell upon the masses of driving clouds, and showed in startling prominence a dark-haired woman, dressed in the cerements of the grave. We could not see the face, for it was bent down over what we saw to be a fair-haired child. There was a pause, and a sharp little cry, such as a child gives in sleep, or as in a dog as it lies before the fire in dreams. We were starting forward, but the professor's warning hand, seen by us as he stood behind the yew tree, kept us back. And then, as we looked, the white figure moved forwards again. It was now near enough for us to see clearly, and the moonlight still held. My own heart grew cold as ice, and I could hear the gasp of Arthur as he recognized the features of Lucy Wainstraw. Lucy Wainstraw, but yet how changed. The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. Van Helsing stepped out, and, obedient to his gesture, we all advanced too. The four of us ranged in a line before the door of the tomb. Van Helsing raised his lantern and drew the slide. By the concentrated light that fell on Lucy's face, we could see that the lips were crimson with fresh blood, and that the stream had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her long death robe. We shuddered with horror. I could see by the tremulous light that even Van Helsing's iron nerve had failed. Arthur was next to me, and if I had not seized his arm and held him up, he would have fallen. When Lucy, I call the thing that was before us Lucy because it bore her shape, saw us, she drew back with an angry snarl, such as a cat gives when taken unawares. Then her eyes ranged over us, Lucy's eyes in form and color, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hellfire, instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. At that moment, the remnant of my love passed into hate and loathing. Had she then to be killed, I could have done it with savage delight. As she looked, her eyes blazed with unholy light, and the face became wreathed with a voluptuous smile. Oh God, how it made me shudder to see it. With a careless motion, she flung to the ground, callous as the devil, the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone. The child gave a sharp cry and lay there moaning. There was a cold bloodlessness in the act, which wrung a groan from Arthur. When she advanced to him with outstretched arms and a wanton smile, he fell back and hid his face in his hands. Still she advanced, however, and with a languorous, voluptuous grace she said, "Come to me, Arthur. Leave these others and come to me. My arms are hungry for you. Come and we can rest together. Come, my husband, come." There was something diabolically sweet in her tones, something of the tingling of glass when struck, which rang through the brains even of us who heard the words addressed to another. As for Arthur, he seemed under a spell. Moving his hands from his face, he opened his wide arms. She was leaping for them when Van Helsing sprang forward and held between them his little golden crucifix. She recoiled from it, and, with a suddenly distorted face, full of rage, dashed past him as if to enter the tomb. When within a foot or two of the door, however, she stopped, as if arrested by some irresistible force. Then she turned, and her face was shown in the clear burst of moonlight, and by the lamp, which had now no quiver from Van Helsing's iron nerves. Never did I see such baffled malice on a face, and never, I trust, shall ever be seen again by mortal eyes. The beautiful color became livid. The eyes seemed to throw out sparks of hellfire. The brows were wrinkled as though the folds of flesh were the coils of Medusa's snakes, and the lovely blood-stained mouth grew to an open square as in the passion masks of the Greeks and the Japanese. If ever a face meant death, if looks could kill, we saw it in that moment. And so, for a full half a minute, which seemed like eternity, she remained between the lifted crucifix and the sacred closing of her means of entry. Van Helsing broke the silence by asking Arthur, "Answer me, O my friend. Am I to proceed with my work?" Arthur threw himself on his knees and hid his face in his hands as he answered, "Do as you will, friend. Do as you will. There can be no horror like this any more," and he groaned in spirit. Quincy and I simultaneously moved towards him and took his arms. We could hear the click of the closing lantern as Van Helsing held it down, coming close to the tomb. He began to remove from the chinks some of the sacred emblem which he had placed there. We all looked in horrified amazement as we saw, when he stood back, the woman with a corporeal body as real at that moment as our own, pass in through the space where scarce a knife blade could have gone. We all felt a glad sense of relief when we saw the professor calmly restoring the strings of putty to the edges of the door. When this was done, he lifted the child and said, "Come now, my friends. We can do no more till tomorrow. There is a funeral at noon, so here we shall come along after that. The friends of the dead will be gone by 2, and when the sexton lock the gate, we shall remain. Then there is more to do, but not like this of tonight. As for this little one, he is not much harm, and by tomorrow night he shall be well. We shall leave him where the police will find him, as on the other night, and then to come, we will home." Coming close to Arthur, he said, "My friend Arthur, you have had a sore trial, but after, when you look back, you will see how it was necessary. You are now in bitter waters, my child. By this time tomorrow you will, please God, have passed them, and have drunk of the sweet waters. So do not mourn over much. Till then I shall not ask you to forgive me." Arthur and Quincy came home with me, and we tried to cheer each other on the way. We had let off the child in safety and were tired, so we all slept more or less with the reality of sleep. 29 September, night. A little before 12 o'clock, we 3, Arthur, Quincy Morris, and myself, called for the professor. It was odd to notice that, by common consent, we had all put on black clothes. Of course, Arthur wore black, for he was in deep mourning, but the rest of us wore it by instinct. We got to the churchyard by 1:30 and strolled about, keeping out of official observation, so that when the grave diggers had completed their task, and the sexton, under the belief that everyone had gone, had locked the gate, we had the place all to ourselves. Van Helsing, instead of his little black bag, had with him a long leather one, something like a cricketing bag. It was manifestly of fair weight. When we were alone, and heard the last footsteps die out up the road, we silently, and as if ordered in tension, followed the professor to the tomb. He unlocked the door, and we entered, closing it behind us. When he took from his bag the lantern which he lit, and also 2 wax candles, which, when lighted, he struck by melting their own ends on other coffins, so that they might give light sufficient to work by. When he again lifted the lid of Lucy's coffin, we all looked, Arthur trembling like an aspen, and saw the body lay there in all its death beauty. But there was no love in my own heart, nothing but loathing for the foul thing that had taken Lucy's shape without her soul. I could see even Arthur's face grow hard as he looked. Presently he said to Van Helsing, "Is this really Lucy's body, or only a demon in her shape?" "It is her body, and yet not it. But wait a while. and you all see her as she was and is. She seemed like a nightmare of Lucy as she lay there, the pointed teeth, the blood-stained voluptuous mouth, which it made one shudder to see. The whole carnal and unspiritual appearance seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Van Helsing, with his usual methodicalness, began taking various contents from his bag and placing them ready for use. First he took out a soldering iron and some plumbing solder, and then a small oil lamp, which gave out, when lit in the corner of the tomb, gas which burned at fierce heat with a blue flame. Then his operating knives, which he placed to hand, and last a round wooden stake, some 2.5 or 3 inches thick and about 3 feet long. One end of it was hardened by charring in the fire and was sharpened to a fine point. With the stake came a heavy hammer, such as in households is used in the coal cellar for breaking up the lumps. To me, a doctor's preparations for work of any kind are stimulating and bracing, but the effect of these things on both Arthur and Quincy was to cause them some sort of consternation. They both, however, kept their courage and remained silent and quiet. When all was ready, Van Helsing said, "Before we do anything, let me tell you this. It is out of the lore and experience of the ancients and all of those who have studied the powers of the undead. When they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead becomes themselves undead and prey on their kind. And so the circle goes on, forever widening, like as the ripples from a stone thrown in water. Friend Arthur, if you had met that kiss which you know of before poor Lucy died, or again, last night, when you open your arms to her, you would in time, when you had died, have become Nosferatu, as they call it in Eastern Europe, and would in all time make more of those undeads that so have filled us with horror. The career of this so unhappy dear lady is just begun. Those children whose blood she suck are not yet so much the worse, but if she live on, undead, more and more, they lose their blood, and by her power over them, they come to her, and so she draw their blood with that wicked mouth. But if she die in truth, then all cease. The tiny wounds of the throats disappear, and they go back to their plays unknowing ever of what has been. But of the most blessed of all, then when this now undead be made to rest as true dead, then the soul of the poor lady whom we love shall again be free. Instead of working wickedness by night, and growing more debased in the assimilating of it by day, she shall take her place with the other angels. So that, my friend, it will be a blessed hand for her that strike the blow that sets her free. To this I am willing, but there is none amongst us who has a better right. Will it be no joy to think of hereafter, in the silence of the night when sleep is not? It was my hand that sent her to the stars. It was the hand of him that loved her best. It was the hand of all she would have herself have chosen, had it been hers to choose. Tell me, if there be such one amongst us. We all looked at Arthur. He saw, too, what we all did, the infinite kindness which suggested that he should be the hand which would restore Lucy to us as a holy and not an unholy memory. He stepped forward and said bravely, though his hand trembled and his face was pale as snow, "My true friend, from the bottom of my broken heart I thank you. Tell me what I am to do, and I shall not falter." Van Helsing laid his hand on his shoulder and said, Brave lad. A moment's courage, and it is done. This stake must be driven through her. It will be a fearful ordeal, be not deceived in it. But it will be only a short time, and you will then rejoice more than your pain was great. From this grim tomb you will emerge as though you tread on air, but you must not falter when once you have begun. Only think that we, your true friends, round you, and that we prayed for you all the time. Go on, said Arthur hoarsely. Tell me what I am to do. Take this stake in your left hand, ready to place the point over the heart, and the hammer in your right. Then, when we begin our prayer for the dead, I shall read him. I have here the book, and the others shall follow. Strike in God's name, so that all may be well with the dead that we love, and that the undead pass away. Arthur took the stake and the hammer, and then once his mind was set on action, his hands never trembled or even quivered. Van Helsing opened his missal and began to read, and Quincy and I followed as well as we could. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as he looked, I could see its dint in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth clamped together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage, so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, and the teeth seemed to champ, and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. The terrible task was over. The hammer fell from Arthur's hand. He reeled and would have fallen had we not caught him. The great drops of sweat sprang from his forehead, and his breath came in broken gasps. It had indeed been an awful strain on him, and had he not been forced to his task by more than human considerations, he could never have gone through with it. For a few minutes we were so taken up with him that we did not look towards the coffin. When we did, however, a murmur of startled surprise ran from one to another of us. We gazed so eagerly that Arthur rose, for he had been seated on the ground, and came and looked too, and then glad, strange light broke over his face, and dispelled altogether the gloom of horror that lay upon it. There in the coffin lay no longer the foul thing that had been so dreaded and grown to hate, that the work of her destruction was yielded as a privilege to the best of anyone entitled to it. But Lucy, as we had seen her in life, with her face unequaled sweetness and purity. True that there were there, as we had seen them in life, the traces of care and pain and waste. But these were all dear to us, for they marked her truth to what we knew. One and all we felt that the holy calm that lay like sunshine over the wasted face and form was only an earthly token and symbol of the calm that was to reign over forever. Van Helsing came and laid his hand on Arthur's shoulder and said to him, "And now, Arthur, my dear friend, dear lad, am I not forgiven?" The reaction of the terrible strain came as he took the old man's hand in his, and raising to his lips, pressed it and said, "Forgiven. God bless you, that you have given my dear one her soul again, and me peace." He put his hands on the professor's shoulder, and laying his hand on his breast, cried for a while silently, whilst we stood unmoving. When he raised his head, Van Helsing said to him, "And now, my child, you may kiss her. Kiss her dead lips if you will, as she would have you to do, if it were hers to choose. For she is not a grinning devil now. not any more a foul thing for all eternity. No longer she is the devil's undead. She is God's true dead, whose soul is with him. Arthur bent and kissed her, and then we sent him and Quincy out of the tomb. The professor and I sawed off the top of the stake, leaving the point of it in the body. Then we cut off the head and filled the mouth with garlic. We soldered up the laden coffin, screwed the coffin lid, and gathering up our belongings came away. When the professor locked the door, he gave the key to Arthur. Outside the air was sweet. The sun shone, and the birds sang. It seemed as if all nature were tuned to a perfect pitch. There was gladness and mirth and peace everywhere, for we were at rest ourselves on one account, and we were glad, though it was a tempered joy. Before we moved away, Van Helsing said, "Now, my friends, one step of our work is done. One, the most harrowing to ourselves, but there remains a greater task, to find out the author of all this our sorrow and to stamp him out. I have clues which we can follow, but it is a long task and difficult, and there is danger in it, and pain. Shall you not all help me? We have learned to believe, all of us, is it not so? And since so, do we not see our duty? Yes. And do we not promise to go on to the bitter end? Each in turn we took his hand, and the promise was made. Then, said the professor as we moved off, 2 nights hence, you shall meet with me and dine together at 7 o'clock with friend John. I shall entreat 2 others, 2 that you know not as yet, and I shall be ready to work, show our plans unfold. Friend John, you come with me home, for I have much to consult about, and you can help me. Tonight I leave for Amsterdam, but shall return tomorrow night, and then begins our great quest. But first I shall have much to say, so that you may know what is to do and to dread. Then our promise shall be made to each other anew, for there is a terrible task before us, and once our feet are on the plowshare, we must not draw back. And with that brings us to the end of chapter 16. A nice little light interlude for that one, really, wouldn't you say? Yeah, everything's fine. So, we brace ourselves with our own little cups of tea. I mean, that was easy peasy lemon squeezy, so the count should be no trouble at all, right? Yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Totally fine. Totes fine. Totes my goats. Can't believe I just said that. Anyway. Feeling spry, minstrel? There you go. Alrighty then. Well then, without any further contributions from our own shenanigans, we shall return to Bram Stoker's Dracula, Chapter 17. Dr. Seward's Diary, continued. When we arrived at the Berkeley Hotel, Van Helsing found a telegram waiting for him. I am coming up by train. Jonathan at Whitby. Important news. Mina Harker. The professor was delighted. Ah, that wonderful Madame Mina, he said. Pearl among women. She arrived, but I cannot stay. She must go to your house, friend John. You must meet her at the station. Telegraph her en route so that she may be prepared. When the wire was dispatched, he had a cup of tea. Over it, he told me of a diary kept by Jonathan Harker when abroad, and gave me a typewritten copy of it, as also of Miss Harker's diary at Whitby. Take these, he said, and study them well. When I have returned, you will be master of all the facts, and we can better enter on our inquisition. Keep them safe, for there is in them much of treasure. You will need all your faith, even you who have had such an experience as today, what there is to be told within. He lay his hand heavily and gravely on the packet of papers as he spoke. Maybe the beginning of the end to you and me and many another, or it may sound the knell of the undead who walk the earth. Read all, I pray you, with the open mind, and if you can add in any way to the story here told, to do so, for it is important. You have kept diary of all these strange things, is it not so? Yes. Then we shall go through all these together when we meet. He then made ready for his departure, and shortly after drove off to Liverpool Street. I took my way to Paddington, where I arrived about 15 minutes before the train came in. The crowd melted away, after the bustling fashion common to arrival platforms, and I was beginning to feel uneasy, lest I missed my guess, when a sweet-faced, dainty-looking girl stepped to me, and after a quick glance said, "Dr. Seward, is it not?" "And you are Miss Harker," I answered at once, whereupon she held out her hand. "I know you from the description of poor Lucy, but—" She stopped suddenly, and a quick blush spread her face. The blush that rose to my own cheeks somehow set us both at ease, for it was a tacit answer to her own. I got her luggage, which included a typewriter, and we took the Underground to Fenchurch Street. After, I sent a wire to my housekeeper to have a sitting room and bedroom prepared for Mrs. Harker. In due time, we arrived. She knew, of course, that the place was a lunatic asylum, but I could see that she was unable to repress a shudder when we entered. She told me that, if she might, she would come presently to my study, as she had much to say. So here I am finishing my entry in my phonograph diary whilst I await her. As yet, I have not had the chance of looking at the papers which Van Helsing left with me, though they lie open before me. I must get her interested in something, so that I might have the opportunity of reading them. She does not know how precious time is, or what a task we have in hand. I must be careful not to frighten her. Here she is. Mina Harker's journal. 29 September. After I had tidied myself, I went down to Dr. Seward's study. At the door, I paused a moment, for I thought I heard him talking with someone. As, however, he had pressed me to come quick, I knocked at the door, and on his calling out, "Come in," I entered. To my intense surprise, there was no one with him. He was quite alone, and on the table opposite him was what I knew at once from the description to be a phonograph. I had never seen one, and was much interested. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," I said, "but I stayed at the door as I heard you talking and thought there was someone with you." "Oh," he replied to my with a smile, "I was only entering my diary." "Your diary?" I asked him in surprise. "Yes," he answered, "I keep it in this." As he spoke, he laid his hand on the phonograph. I felt quite excited over it and blurted out, "Why, this beats even shorthand. May I hear it say something?" "Certainly," he replied with alacrity, and stood up and put it in train for speaking. Then he paused, and a troubled look overspread his face. "The fact is," he began awkwardly, "I only keep my diary in it, and as it is almost entirely about my cases, it may be awkward. That is, I mean..." He stopped, and I tried to help him out of his embarrassment. "You helped to attend to dear Lucy at the end. Let me hear how she died. For all that I know of her, I shall be grateful. She was very, very dear to me." To my surprise, he answered with a horror-struck look on his face, "Tell you of her death? Not for the wide world." "Why not?" I asked, for some grave, terrible feeling was coming over me. Again he paused, and I could see he was trying to invent an excuse. At length he stammered out, "You see, I do not know how to pick out any particular part of the diary." Even while he was speaking, an idea dawned on him, and he said with unconscious simplicity, in a different voice with the naivete of a child. "It's quite true, upon my honor. Honest Indian." I could not but smile, at which he grimaced. "I gave myself away that time," he said. "But do you know that, although I have kept the diary for months past, it never once struck me how I was going to find any particular part of it in case I wanted to look it up?" By this time my mind was made up that the diary of the doctor who attended Lucy might be something to add to the sum of her knowledge of that terrible being, and I said boldly, "Then, Dr. Seward, you had better let me copy it out for you on my typewriter." He grew to a positively deathly pallor and said, "No, no, no. For all the world I wouldn't let you know that terrible story." Then it was terrible. My intuition was right. For a moment I thought, and as my eyes ranged the room, unconsciously looking for something, or some opportunity to aid me, they lit on a great batch of typewriting on the table. His eyes caught the look in mine, and, without his thinking, followed their direction. As they saw the parcel, he realized my meaning. "You do not know me," I said. "When you have read those papers, my own diary and my husband's also, which I have typed, you will know me better. I have not faltered in giving every thought of my own heart in this cause, but, of course, you do not know me, yet, and I must not expect you to trust me so far. He is certainly a man of noble nature. Poor dear Lucy was right about him." He stood up and opened a large drawer, in which were arranged in order a number of hollow cylinders of metal covered with dark wax, and said, "You are quite right. I did not trust you because I did not know you, but I know you now, and let me say that I should have known long ago. I know that Lucy told you of me. She told me of you too. May I ask the only atonement in my power? Take the cylinders and hear them. The first half-dozen of them are personal to me, and they will not horrify you. Then you will know me better. Dinner by then will be ready. In the meantime, I shall read over some of these documents and should better be able to understand certain things." He carried the phonograph himself to my sitting room and adjusted it for me. "Now I shall learn something pleasant, I am sure, for it will tell me the other side of a true love episode of which I know one side already." Dr. Seward's Diary, 29 September. I was so absorbed in that wonderful diary of Jonathan Harker and that other of his wife that I let time run on without thinking. Mrs. Harker was not down when the maid came to announce dinner, so I said, "She is probably tired. Let dinner wait an hour," and I went on with my work. I had just finished Mrs. Harker's diary when she came in. She looked sweetly pretty, but very sad, and her eyes were flushed with crying. This somehow moved me much. Of late I have had cause for tears, God knows, but the relief of them was denied me, and now the sight of those sweet eyes, brightened with recent tears, went straight to my heart. So, as gently as I could, I said, "I greatly fear I have distressed you." "Oh no, not distressed me," she replied, "but I have been more touched than I can say by your grief. That is a wonderful machine, but it is cruelly true. It told me, in its very tones, the anguish in your heart. It was like the soul crying out to Almighty God. No one must hear them spoken ever again. See, I have tried to be useful. I have copied out the words in my typewriter, and now the other need now hear your heartbeat as I did. No one need ever know, shall ever know," I said in a low voice. She laid her hand on mine and said very gravely, "Ah, but they must." "Must? But why?" I asked. "Because it is part of the terrible story, a part of poor dear Lucy's death, and all that led to it. Because in the struggle which we have before us to rid the earth of this terrible monster, we must have all the knowledge and all the help which we can get. I think that the cylinders which you gave me contained more than you intended me to know, but I can see that there are in your record many lights to this dark mystery. Will you let me help, will you not? I know all up to a certain point. I see already, through your diary, only took me to 7th September, how poor Lucy was beset, how her terrible doom was being wrought out. Jonathan and I have been working day and night since Professor Van Helsing saw us. He has gone to Whitby to get more information. He will be there tomorrow to help us. We need have no secrets amongst us. Working together, with absolute trust, we can surely be stronger than if some of us were in the dark. She looked at me so appealingly, and at the time manifested such courage and resolution in her being, that I gave in at once to her wishes. You shall, I said. Do as you like in the matter. God forgive me if I do wrong. There are terrible things yet to learn of. But if you have so far traveled on the road to poor Lucy's death, you will not be content, I know, to remain in the dark. Nay, the end, the very end, may give you a gleam of peace. Come, there is dinner. We must keep one another strong for what is before us. We have a cruel and dreadful task. When you have eaten, you shall learn the rest, and I shall answer any questions you ask. If there be anything you do not understand, though it was apparent to us who were present. Mina Harker's Journal, 29 September. After dinner, I came with Dr. Seward to his study. He brought back the phonograph from my room, and I took my typewriter. He placed me in a comfortable chair and arranged the phonograph so that I could touch it without getting up, and showed me how to stop it in case I should want to pause. Then he very thoroughly and thoughtfully took a chair with his back to me so that I might be as free as possible and begin to read. I put the forked metal to my ears and listened. When the terrible story of Lucy's death and all that followed was done, I lay back in my chair powerless. Fortunately, I am not of the fainting disposition. When Dr. Seward saw me, he jumped up with a horrified exclamation and hurriedly, taking a case bottle from a cupboard, gave me some brandy, which in a few minutes somewhat restored me. My brain was all in a whirl, and only that there came in the multitude of horrors the holy ray of light that my dear, dear Lucy was at last at peace. I do not think I could have borne it without making a scene. It is all so wild and mysterious and strange that if I had not known of Jonathan's experience in Transylvania, I could not have believed. As it was, I did not know what to believe, and so got out of my difficulty by attending to something else. I took off the cover of my typewriter and said to Dr. Seward, "Let me write all this now. We must be ready for Dr. Van Helsing when he comes. I have sent a telegram to Jonathan to come on here when he arrives in London from Whitby. This matter dates are everything, and I think that if we get all our material ready and have every item put in chronological order, we shall have done much. You tell me that Lord Godalming and Mr. Morris are coming too. Let us be able to tell them when they come." He accordingly set the phonograph at a slow pace, and I began to typewrite from the beginning of the 7th cylinder. I used a manifold, and so took 3 copies of the diary, just as I had done with all the rest. It was late when I got through, but Dr. Seward went about his work of going round with his patients. When I had finished, he came back and sat near me, reading, so that I did not feel too lonely whilst I worked. How good and thoughtful he is. The world seems full of good men, even if there are monsters in it. Before I left him, I remembered what Jonathan put in his diary of the professor's perturbation at reading something in an evening paper at the station at Exeter. So seeing that Dr. Seward keeps his newspapers, I borrowed the files of the Westminster Gazette and the Pall Mall Gazette, and took them to my room. I remember how much the Daily Graph and the Whitby Gazette, of which I had made cuttings, helped us to understand the terrible events at Whitby when Count Dracula landed. So I shall look through the evening papers since then, and perhaps I shall get some new light. I am not sleepy, and the work will help keep me quiet. Dr. Seward's Diary, 30 September. Mr. Harker arrived at 9 o'clock. He had just got his wife's wire before starting. He is uncommonly clever, if one can judge from his face, and full of energy. If this journal be true, and judging by one's own wonderful experiences it must be, he is also a man of great nerve. That going down to the vault a second time was a remarkable piece of daring. After reading his account of it, I was prepared to meet a good specimen of manhood, but hardly the quiet, business-like gentleman who came here today. Later. After lunch, Harker and his wife went back to their own room, and as I passed a while ago, I heard the click of a typewriter. They are hard at it. Mrs. Harker says they are knitting together in chronological order every scrap of evidence they have. Harker has got the letters between the consignee of the boxes at Whitby and the carriers in London who took charge of them. He is now reading his wife's transcript of my diary. I wonder what they make out of it. Here it is. Strange that it never struck me that the very next house might be the Count's hiding place. Goodness knows that we had enough clues from the conduct of the patient Renfield. The bundle of letters relating to the purchase of the house were with the typescript. Oh, if we had only had them earlier, we might have saved poor Lucy. Stop. That way madness lies. Harker has gone back, and is again collating his material. He says that by dinner time they will be able to show a whole connected narrative. He thinks that in the meantime I should see Renfield, as hitherto he has been sort of the index to the coming and going of the Count. I hardly see this yet, but when I get the dates I suppose I shall. What a good thing that Mrs. Harker put all my cylinders into type. We never could have found the dates otherwise. I found Renfield sitting placidly in his room with his hands folded, smiling benignly. At the moment he seemed as sane as anyone I ever knew. I sat down and talked with him on a lot of subjects, all of which he treated naturally. He then, of his own accord, spoke of going home, a subject he had never mentioned to my knowledge during his sojourn here. In fact, he spoke quite confidently of getting his discharge at once. I believe that, had I not had the chat with Harker and read the letters and the dates of his outbursts, I should have been prepared to sign for him after a brief time of observation. As it is, I am darkly suspicious. All those outbreaks were in some way linked to the proximity of the Count. What does this absolute content mean? Can it be that his instinct is satisfied as to the vampire's ultimate triumph? Say, if he himself, Fagus, and in his wild ravings outside the chapel door of the deserted house he always spoke of Master. This all seems confirmation of our idea. However, after a while I came away, my friend just a little too sane at present to make it safe to probe him too deep with questions. He might begin to think, and then... So I came away. I must trust these quiet moods of his. So I have given the attendant a hint to look closely after him, and to have a straight waistcoat ready in case of need. Jonathan Harker's Journal, 29 September. In train to London. When I received Mr. Billington's courteous message that he would give me any information in his power, I thought it was best to go down to Whitby and make on the spot such inquiries as I wanted. It was now my object to trace that horrid cargo of the Count's to its place in London. Later, we may be able to deal with it. Billington's junior, a nice lad, met me at the station and brought me to his father's house. where they had decided that I must stay the night. They are hospitable, with true Yorkshire hospitality. Give a guest everything, and leave him free to do as he likes. They all knew that I was busy, and that my stay was short, and Mr. Billington had ready in his office all the papers concerning the consignment of boxes. It gave me almost a turn to see again one of those letters which I had seen on the Count's table before I knew of his diabolical plans. Everything had been carefully thought out, and done systematically and with precision. He seemed to have been prepared for every obstacle which might be placed by accident in the way of his intentions being carried out. To use an Americanism, he had taken no chances, and the absolute accuracy with which his instructions were fulfilled was simply the logical result of his care. I saw the invoice and took note of it. 50 cases of common earth, to be used for experimental purposes. Also, the copy of the letter to Carter Patterson, and their reply. Of both of these I got copies. This was all the information Mr. Billington could give me. So I went down to the port and saw the coast guards, the customs officers, and the harbor master. They all had something to say of the strange entry of the ship, which is already taking its place in local tradition, but no one could add to the simple description 50 cases of common earth. I then saw the station master, who kindly put me in communication with the men who had actually received the boxes. Their tally was exact with the list, and they had nothing to add except that the boxes were mean and mortal heavy, and that shifting them was dry work. One of them added that it was hard lines, and that there wasn't any gentleman, such as like yourself, Squire, to show some sort of appreciation for their efforts in a liquid form. Another put in a rider that the thirst then generated was such that even the time which had elapsed had not completely allayed it. Needless to add, I took care, before giving to lift, forever and adequately, this source of reproach. 30 September. The station master was good enough to give me a line to his old companion, the station master at King's Cross, so that when I arrived there in the morning, I was able to ask him about the arrival of the boxes. He, too, put me at once in communication with the proper officials, and I saw that their tally was correct with the original invoice. The opportunities of acquiring an abnormal thirst had been limited. A noble use of them had, however, been made, and again I was compelled to deal with the result in an ex post facto manner. From thence, I went on to Carter Patterson's central office, where I met with the utmost courtesy. They looked up the transaction in their day book and letter book, and at once telephoned to their King's Cross office for more details. By good fortune, the men who did the teaming were waiting for work, and the official at once sent them over, sending also by one of them the way-bill and all the papers connected with the delivery of the boxes at Carfax. Here again I found the tally agreeing exactly. The carrier's men were able to supplement the paucity of written words with a few details. There were, I shortly found, connected almost solely with the dusty nature of the job and of the consequent thirst engendered by the operators. On my affording an opportunity, though the medium of the currency of the realm, of allaying at the later period this beneficial evil, one of the men remarked, that there house, Governor, is the rummiest I was ever in. Lime, but it ain't been touched since 100 years. There was dust that thick that place that might have slept on without hurting your bones. The place was that neglected, might have smelled of old Jerusalem in it, but the old chapel, that took the cake, it did. Me and my mate were thwart we weren't never get out quick enough. Lord, I wouldn't take less nor than a quid a moment to stay there out after dark. Having been in the house, I could well believe him. But if he knew what I knew, he would, I think, have raised his terms. Of one thing I am now satisfied, that all the boxes which arrived at Whitby from Varna in the Demeter were safely deposited in the old chapel at Carfax. There should be 50 of them there, unless any have been removed, as from Dr. Seward's diary, I fear. I shall try to see the carter who took away the boxes from Carfax when Renfield attacked them. By following up this clue, we may learn a good deal. Later, Mina and I have worked all day, and we have put all of the papers in order. Mina Harker's Journal, 30 September. I am so glad that I hardly know how to contain myself. It is, I suppose, the reaction from the haunting fear which I must have had, that this terrible affair and the reopening of this old wound might detrimentally act on Jonathan. I saw him leave for Whitby with as brave a face as I could, but I was sick with apprehension. The effort was, however, done him good. He was never so resolute, never so strong, never so full of volcanic energy as at present. It is just as that, my dear, good Professor Van Helsing said. He is true grit. He improves under strain, and that would kill a weaker nature. He came back full of life and hope and determination. We have got everything in order for tonight. I feel myself quite wild with excitement. I suppose one ought to pity anything so haunted as the Count. That is just it. This thing is not human, not even beast. To read Dr. Seward's account of poor Lucy's death and what followed, it is enough to dry up any springs of pity in one's heart. Later. Lord Godalming and Mr. Morris arrived later than we expected. Dr. Seward was out on business and taking Jonathan with him, so I had to see them. It was to me a painful meeting, for it brought back all the poor dear Lucy's hopes of only a few months ago. Of course, they had heard Lucy speak of me, and it seemed that Dr. Van Helsing, too, had been quite blowing my trumpet, as Mr. Morris expressed it. Poor fellows, neither of them is aware that I know all about the proposals they made to Lucy. They did not know what to say or do, as they are ignorant of the amount of my knowledge, so they had to keep on neutral subjects. However, I thought the matter over, and came to the conclusion that the best thing I could do would be to post them in the affairs up to date. I knew from Dr. Seward's diary that they had been at Lucy's death, her real death, and that I need not fear to betray any secrets before their time. So I told them, as well as I could, they had read all the papers and diaries, and that my husband and I, having typewritten them, had just finished putting them in order. I gave them each a copy to read in the library. When Lord Godalming got his and turned it over, it does make a pretty good pile, he said. Did you write all this, Mrs. Harker? I nodded, and he went on. I don't quite see the drift of it, but you people are all so good and kind, and have been working so earnestly and so energetically that all I can do is accept your ideas blindfold and try to help you. I have had one lesson already in accepting facts that should make a man humble to the last hour of his life. Besides, I know you loved my poor Lucy. Here he turned away and covered his face with his hands. I could hear the tears in his voice. Mr. Morris, with instinctive delicacy, just laid a hand for a moment on his shoulder, and then walked quietly out of the room. I suppose there is something in women's nature that makes a man free to break down before her and express his feelings on the tender or emotional side without feeling it derogatory to his manhood. For when Lord Godalming found himself alone with me, he sat down on the sofa and gave away utterly and openly. I sat down beside him and took his hand. I hope he didn't think it forward of me, and that he ever thinks of it afterwards, he will never have such a thought. There I wrong him. I know he never will. He is too true a gentleman. I said to him, for I could see his heart was breaking, I loved dear Lucy, and I know what she was to you, and what you were to her. She and I were like sisters, she is gone. Will you not let me be like a sister to you in your trouble? I know what sorrows you have had, though I cannot measure the depth of them. If sympathy and pity can help in your affliction, won't you let me be of some little service for Lucy's sake? In an instant, the poor dear fellow was overwhelmed with grief. It seemed to me that all had been of late suffering in silence found a vent at once. He grew quite hysterical, and raising his open hands, beat his palms together in a perfect agony of grief. He stood up and then sat down again, and the tears rained down his cheeks. I felt an infinite pity for him, and opened my arms unthinkingly. With a sob he laid his head on my shoulder and cried like a wearied child, whilst he shook with emotion. We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters when the mother spirit is invoked. I felt this big, sorrowing man's head rest upon me, as though it were that of a baby that in some May day may lie on my bosom, and I stroked his hair as though it were my own child. I never thought at the time how strange it all was. After a little bit, his sobs ceased, and he raised himself with an apology, though he made no disguise of his emotions. He told me that for days and nights past, weary days and sleepless nights, he had been able to speak with anyone, as a man must speak in timeless sorrow. There was no woman whose sympathy could be given to him, nor with whom, owing to the terrible circumstance with which his sorrow was surrounded, he could speak freely. I now know how I suffered, he said, as he dried his eyes, but I do not know even yet, and none other can ever know, how much your sweet sympathy has been to me today. I shall know better in time, and believe me that, though I am not ungrateful now, my gratitude will grow with understanding. You will let me be like a brother, will you not, for all our lives, for dear Lucy's sake? For dear Lucy's sake, I said, as we clasped hands. Aye, and for our own sake, he added. For if a man's esteem and gratitude are ever worth the winning, you have won mine today. If ever the future should bring you to a time when you need a man's help, believe me, you will not call in vain. God grant that no such time ever come to you to break the sunshine of your life. But if ever it should come, promise me that you will let me know. He was so earnest, and his sorrow was so fresh, that I felt it would comfort him, so I said, I promise. As I came along the corridor, I saw Mr. Morris looking out of a window. He turned as he heard my footsteps. How is Art? He said. Then, noticing my red eyes, he went on. Ah, I see you have been comforting him. Poor old fellow. He needs it. No one but a woman can help a man when he is in trouble of the heart, and he has had no one to comfort him. He bore his own trouble so bravely that my heart bled for him. I saw the manuscript in his hand. I know that when he read it, he would realize how much I knew. So I said to him, I wish I could comfort all who suffer from the heart. Will you let me be your friend? And will come to me for comfort if you need it? You will know later on why I speak. He saw I was in earnest, and stooping, took my hand, raising it to his lips, kissed it. It seemed but poor comfort to so brave and unselfish a soul, and impulsively I bent over and kissed him. The tears rose in his eyes, and there was a momentary choking in his throat. He said quite calmly, Little girl, you'll never regret that true-hearted kindness so long as you live. Then he went into the study with his friend. Little girl. The very words he had used to Lucy, and oh, but he proved himself a friend. And that brings us to the end of chapter 17. An interesting interlude we're getting this one, wouldn't you say? We're actually, having our characters actually deal with the horror they're going through. Most refreshing compared to some other stories I could think of where they just press on in superhuman bravery. Without so much as a spot of tea. Alrighty then. Clearing of the throat, dislocating of any fingers needs bees. There you go. Alrighty then. Once more onto the breach. For chapter 18 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dr. Seward's Diary, 30 September. I got home at 5 o'clock and found that Godalming and Morris had not only arrived, but had already studied the transcript of the various diaries and letters which Harker and his wonderful wife had made and arranged. Harker had not yet returned from his visit to the carrier's men, of whom Dr. Hennessy had written to me. Mrs. Harker gave us a cup of tea, and I can honestly say for the first time since I have lived in it, this house seemed like home. When we finished, Mrs. Harker said, "Dr. Seward, may I ask a favor? I want to see your patient, Mr. Renfield. Do let me see him. What you have said of him in your diary interests me so much." She looked so appealing and so pretty that I could not refuse her, and there was no possible reason why I should, so I took her with me. When I went into the room, I told the man a lady would like to see him, to which he simply answered, "Why?" "She is going through the house and wants to see everyone in it," I answered. "Oh, very well," he said. "Let her come in, by all means. But just wait a minute till I tidy up the place." His method of tidying was peculiar. He simply swallowed all the flies and spider in the boxes before I could stop him. It was quite evident that he feared, or was jealous of, some interference. When he'd got through his disgusting task, he said cheerfully, "Let the lady come in," and sat down on the edge of the bed with his head down, but his eyelids raised, so that he could see her when she entered. For a moment I thought he might have some homicidal intent, and I remembered how quiet he had been just before he attacked me in my own study, and I took care to stand where I could seize him at once if he attempted to make a spring at her. She came into the room with an easy gracefulness which would at once command the respect of any lunatic, for easiness is one of the qualities mad people most respect. She walked over to him, smiling pleasantly, and held out her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Renfield," she said. "You see, I know you, for Dr. Seward has told me of you." He made no immediate reply, but eyed her all over intently, with a set frown on his face. This look gave way to one of wonder, which merged in doubt, and then, to my intense astonishment, he said, "You're not the girl the doctor wanted to marry, are you? You can't be, you know, for she is dead." Mrs. Harker smiled sweetly as she replied, "Oh no, I have a husband of my own, to whom I was married before I ever saw Dr. Seward, or he me. I am Mrs. Harker." "Then what are you doing here?" "My husband and I are staying on a visit with Dr. Seward." "Then don't stay." "But why not?" I thought that this style of conversation might not be pleasant to Mrs. Harker any more than it was to me, so I joined in. "How did you know I wanted to marry anyone?" His reply was simply contemptuous, given in a pause in which his eyes turned from Mrs. Harker to me, instinctively turning back again. "What an asinine question!" "I don't see that at all, Mr. Renfield," said Mrs. Harker, at once championing me. He replied to her with as much courtesy and respect as he had shown contempt to me. "You will of course understand, Mrs. Harker, that when a man is so loved and honored as our host is, everything regarding him is of interest in our little community. Dr. Seward is loved, not only by his household and his friends, but even by his patients, who, being of some hardly in mental equilibrium, are apt to distort causes and effects. Since I myself have been inmate of a lunatic asylum, I cannot but notice that the sophistic tendencies of some of his inmates lean towards the errors of non causa and aggrego elenchi. I positively opened my eyes at this new development. Here was my own pet lunatic, the most pronounced of his type I have ever met with, talking elemental philosophy and with a manner of a polished gentleman. I wonder if it was Mrs. Harker's presence which had touched some chord in his memory. If this new phase was spontaneous, or in any way due to her unconscious influence, she must have some rare gift or power. We continued to talk for some time, and seeing he was seemingly quite reasonable, she ventured, looking at me questioningly as she began, to lead him to his favorite topic. I was again astonished, for he addressed himself to the question with the impartiality and of completest sanity. He even took himself as an example when he mentioned certain things. Why, I myself am an instance of a man who had a strange belief. Indeed, it was no wonder that my friends were alarmed and insisted on my being put under control. I used to fancy that life was a positive and perpetual entity, and that by consuming a multitude of living things, no matter how low on the scale of creation, one might indefinitely prolong life. It seems I held that belief so strongly that I actually tried to take human life. The doctor here will bear me out that on one occasion I tried to kill him for the purpose of strengthening my vital powers by the assimilation with my body of his life through the medium of his blood, relying, of course, on the scriptural phrase, "For the blood is the life," though, indeed, the vendor of a certain nostrum has vulgarized the truism to the very point of contempt. Isn't that true, Doctor? I nodded assent, for I was so amazed that I hardly knew what either to think or to say. It was hard to imagine that I had seen him eat up spiders and flies not 5 minutes before. Looking at my watch, I saw that I should go to the station to meet Van Helsing, so I told Mrs. Harker it was time to leave. She came at once, after saying pleasantly to Mr. Renfield, "Goodbye. I hope I may see you often, under auspices pleasanter to yourself." To which, to my astonishment, he replied, "Goodbye, my dear. I pray God I may never see your sweet face again. May he bless and keep you." When I went to the station to meet Van Helsing, I left the boys behind me. Poor Art seemed more cheerful than he had been since Lucy first took ill, and Quincy is more like his own bright self than he had been for many a long day. Van Helsing stepped from the carriage with the eager nimbleness of a boy. He saw me at once and rushed to me, saying, "Ah, friend John, how goes all? Well? So, I have been busy, for I come here to stay if need be. All affairs are settled with me, and I have much to tell. Madam Mina is with you? Yes? And her so fine husband? And Arthur? And my friend Quincy? They are here with you too? Good." As I drove to the house, I told him of what has passed, and how my own diary had come to be of some use through Mrs. Harker's suggestion, at which the professor interrupted me. "Ah, that wonderful Madam Mina. She has a man's brain. A brain that a man should have if he were much gifted, and a woman's heart. The good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination. Friend John, up to now, a fortune has made that woman of help to us. After tonight, she must not have to do with this terrible affair. It is not good that she run a risk so great. We men are determined, nay, are we not pledged, to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. Even if she be not harmed, her heart may fail her in so much and so many horrors, and hereafter she may suffer, both in waking from her nerves and in sleep, from dreams. And besides, she is a young woman, and not long married. There may be other things to think of some time, if not now. You tell me she has wrote all. Then she must consult with us. But tomorrow she say goodbye to this work, and we go alone. I agreed heartily with him, and then I told him that we had found, in his absence, that the house which Dracula had bought was the very next to my own. He was amazed, and a great concern seemed to come over him. Oh, that we had known before, he said, for that we might have reached M in time to save poor Lucy. However, the milk is spilt cries not out afterwards, as you say. We shall not think of it, but go on our way to the end. Then he fell into silence that lasted till we entered my own gateway. Before we went to prepare for dinner, he said to Mrs. Harker, I am told, Madam Mina, by my friend John, that you and your husband have put up in exact order all things that have been up to this moment. Not up to this moment, Professor, she said impulsively, but up to this morning. But why not up to now? We have seen hitherto all good light all the little things have made. We have told our secrets, and yet no one has told is the worse for it. Mrs. Harker began to blush, and taking a paper from her pocket, she said, Dr. Van Helsing, will you read this, and tell me if it must go in? It is my record of today. I, too, have seen the need of putting down at present everything, however trivial. But there is little in this except what is personal. Must it go in? The professor read it over gravely and handed it back, saying, It need not go in if you do not wish it, but I pray that it may. It can but make your husband love you the more, and all of us your friends more honor you, as we will with more esteem and love. She took it back, and with another blush and a bright smile. And so now, up to this very hour, all the records we have are complete and in order. The professor took away one copy to his study after dinner, and before meeting, which is fixed for 9 o'clock, the rest of us have already read everything, so that when we meet in the study, we shall all be informed as to the facts and can arrange our plan of battle with this terrible and mysterious enemy. Mina Harker's Journal, 30 September. When we met in Dr. Seward's study, 2 hours after dinner, which had been at 6 o'clock, we unconsciously formed a sort of board or committee. Professor Van Helsing took the head of the table, to which Dr. Seward motioned him as he came into the room. He made me sit next to him on his right, and asked me to act as secretary. Jonathan sat next to me. Opposite us were Lord Godalming, Dr. Seward, and Mr. Morris. Lord Godalming being next to the professor, and Dr. Seward in the center. The professor said, I may, I suppose, take it that we are all acquainted with the facts that are in these papers. We all expressed assent, and he went on. Then it were, I think, good that I tell you something of the kind of enemy with which we have to deal. I shall then make known to you something of the history of this man, which has been ascertained for me, so we can discuss how we shall act and take our measure accordingly. There are such things as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teaching and records of the past prove enough for sane peoples. I admit that at first I was skeptic. Were it not through long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind, I could not have believed until such time as the fact thunder on my ear. See, I prove. Alas, had I known at first what now I know, nay, had I even guessed at them, one so precious life had been spared to many of us who did love her. But that is gone, and we must so work that other poor souls perish not, whilst we can save. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he sting once. He is only stronger, and being stronger, have yet more power to work evil. This vampire, which is amongst us, is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. He is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. He still have the aids of necromancy, which is, as its etymology imply, the divination by the dead, and all the dead that he can come nigh to are for him to command. He is brute, and more than brute. He is devil and callous, and the heart of him is not. He can, within limitations, appear at will, when and where, in any of the forms that are to him. He can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can command all the meaner things, the rat, the owl, and the bat, and the moth, and the fox, and the wolf. He can grow and become small. He can at times vanish and become unknown. How then are we to begin our strike to destroy him? How shall we find his where? And having found it, how can we destroy? My friends, this is much. It is a terrible task that we undertake, and there may be consequence to make the brave shudder. For if we fail in our fight, that we must surely win, and then where end we? Life is nothing's, I heed him not, but to fail here is not mere life or death. It is that we become as him, that we henceforward become foul things of the night like him, without heart or consequence, preying on the bodies and souls of those we love best. To us forever are the gates of heaven shut, for who shall open them us to again? We go on for all time, abhorred by all, a blot on the face of God's sunshine, an arrow in the side of him who died for man. But we are to face to face with duty, and in such we must not shrink. For me, I say no, but I am old, and life, with his sunshine, his fair places, his song of birds, his music and his love, lie far behind. You others are young, some have seen sorrow, there are fair days yet in store. What say you? Whilst he was speaking, Jonathan had taken my hand. I feared, oh so much, that the appalling nature of our danger was overcoming him, when I saw his hand stretch out. But it was life to me to feel its touch, so strong, so self-reliant, so resolute. A brave man's hand can speak for itself. It does not even need a woman's love to hear its music. When the professor had done speaking, my husband looked in my eyes, and I in his, and there was no need for speaking between us. I answered for Mina and myself, he said. Count me in, Professor, said Quincy Morris, laconically as usual. I'm with you, said Lord Godalming, for Lucy's sake, if for no other reason. Dr. Seward simply nodded. The professor stood up, and, after laying his golden crucifix on the table, held out his hand on the other side. I took his right hand and Lord Godalming's left. Jonathan held my right with his left and stretched across to Mr. Morris. So as we all took hands, our solemn compact was made. I felt my heart icy cold, but it did not even occur to me to draw back. We resumed our places, and Dr. Van Helsing went on with a sort of cheerfulness which showed that the serious work had begun. It had to be taken as gravely and as in businesslike a way as any other transaction of life. Well, you know what we have to contend against, but we too are not without strength. We have on our side the power of combination, a power denied to the vampire kind. We have sources of science. We are free to act and think, and the hours of the day and night are ours equally. In fact, so far as our powers extend, they are unfettered, and we are free to use them. We have self-devotion in a cause, and an end to achieve, which is not a selfish one. These things are much. Now, let us see how far the general powers arrayed us restrict, and how the individual cannot. In fine, let us consider the limitations of the vampire in general, and of this one in particular. All we have to go on are traditions and superstitions. These do not appear at first like much, when the matter is one of life and death, nay of more, either life or death. Yet we must be satisfied, in the first place because we have to be, no other means is at our control, and secondly because after all these things, tradition and superstition are everything. Does not believe in vampires rest for others, though not, alas, for us on them? A year ago, which of us would have received such a possibility in the midst of our scientific, skeptical, matter-of-fact 19th century? We even scouted a belief that we saw justified under our very eyes. Take it then that the vampire and the belief in his limitations and his cure rest for the moment on the same base. For me, let me tell you, he is known everywhere that men have been, in old Greece, in old Rome. He flourished in Germany all over, in France, in India, even in China, so far from us in all ways, yet there even is he, and the peoples far from him this day. He have followed the wake of the berserker Icelander, the devil-begotten Hun, the Slav, the Saxon, and the Magyar. So far, then, we have all we may act upon, and let me tell you very much of the beliefs are justified by what we have seen by our own unhappy experience. The vampire live on, and cannot die by mere passing of time. He can flourish when that he can fatten on the blood of the living. Even more, we have seen amongst us that he can grow younger, that his vital faculties grow strenuous, and seem as though they relish themselves when his special pabulum is plenty. But he cannot flourish without his diet. He eat not as others. Even friend Jonathan, who lived with him for weeks, did never see him to eat, never. He throws no shadow. He make in the mirror no reflect, as again Jonathan observed. He has the strength of many in his hand. Witness again, Jonathan, when he shut the door against the wolves, and then he help him from the diligence too. He can transform himself to wolf, as we gather from the ship arrival at Whitby. When he tear open the dog, he can be as bat, as Madame Meenham saw in the window at Whitby, and his friend John saw fly not far from this house, as my friend Quincy saw at the window of Miss Lucy. He can come in mist which he create. That noble ship's captain proved him of this, but, from what we know, the distance he can make this mist is limited, and it can only be around himself. He come on moonlight rays as elemental dust, as again Jonathan saw those sisters in the castle of Dracula. He became so small, we ourselves saw Miss Lucy, ere she was at peace, slip through a hairbrush space at the tomb door. He can, when once he find his way, come out from anything or into anything, no matter how close it be around, or even fused up with fire, a solder, you call it. He can see in the dark, no small power this, in a world which is one half shut from light. Ah, but hear me though, he can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave of the galley, than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has to obey some of nature's laws. Why, we know not. He may not enter anywhere at first, unless there be someone of the household who bid him to come, though afterwards he can come as he pleases. His power ceases, as does that of all evil things, at the coming of the day. Only at certain times can he have limited freedom. If he be not at the place whither he is bound, he can only change himself at noon or at exact sunrise or sunset. These things we are told, and in this record of ours we have proof by inference. Thus, whereas he can do as he will within his limit, when he have his earth home, his coffin home, his hell home, his place unhallowed, as we saw when we went to the grave of the suicide at Whitby, still, At another time he can only change when the time come. It is said, too, he can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide. Then there are things which so afflict him that he has no power, as the garlic that we know of, and as for things sacred, as this symbol, my crucifix. That was amongst us even now when we resolve. To him he is nothing, but in their presence he take the place far off and silent with respect. There are others too, which I shall tell you of, lest in our seeking we may need them. The branch of a wild rose on his coffin keep him that he move not from it. A sacred bullet fired into the coffin kill him so that he is true dead. And as for the stake through him, we already know of its peace, or the cut off head that giveth rest. We have seen that with our eyes. Thus, when we find the habitation of this man that was, we can confine him to his coffin and destroy him, if we obey what we know. But he is clever. I have asked my friend Arminius of Budapest University to make his record, and from all means there are, he tell me of what he has been. He must indeed have been that of Voivode Dracula, who won his name against the Turk over the great river on the very frontier of Turkeyland. Be it so, then he is no common man, for in that time and for centuries after he was spoken of as the cleverest and most cunning, as well as of the bravest sons of the land beyond the forest. That mighty brain and that iron resolution went with him to his grave, and are even now arrayed against us. The Draculas were, says the Arminius, a great and noble race, though now and again were scions who were held by their covils to have had dealings with the evil one. They learned his secrets in the Scholomance amongst the mountains over Lake Hermstad, where the devil claims the 10th scholar as his due. In the records are such words as Strakoga, witch, Ordog, and Pokol, Satan, and hell. And in one manuscript, this very Dracula is spoken of as vampire, which we all understood too well. There have been from the loins of this very one great man and good women, and their graves make sacred the earth where alone this foulness can dwell. For it is not the least of its terrors that this evil thing is rooted deep in all good. In soil barren of holy memories it cannot rest. Whilst they were talking, Mr. Morris was looking steadily at the window. He now got up quietly and went out of the room. There was a little pause, and the professor went on. And now we must settle what we do. We have here much data, and must proceed to lay out our campaign. We know from the inquiry of Jonathan, from the castle to Whitby, came 50 boxes of earth, all of which were delivered at Carfax. We know that at least some of these boxes have been removed. It seems to me that our first step would be to ascertain whether all the rest remain in the house beyond that wall where we look today, or whether any more have been removed. If the latter, we must trace. Here we were interrupted in a startling way. Outside the house came the sound of a pistol shot. The glass of the window shattered with a bullet which, ricocheting from the top of the embrasure, struck the far wall of the room. I am afraid I am at heart a coward, for I shrieked out. The men all jumped to their feet. Lord Godalming flew over to the window and threw up the sash. As he did so, he heard Mr. Morris's voice without. "Sorry, I fear I may have alarmed you. I shall come in and tell you about it." A minute later he came in and said, "It was an idiotic thing for me to do, and I ask your pardon, Mrs. Harker, most sincerely. I fear I must have frightened you terribly. But the fact is that while the professor was talking, there came a big bat that sat on the windowsill. I have got such a horror of the damned brutes from recent events that I cannot stand them, and I went out to have a shot, as I have been doing of late evenings whenever I've seen one. You used to laugh at me for it, then, Art. Did you hit it? asked Dr. Van Helsing. I don't know. I fancy not, for it flew away into the wood. Without saying any more, he took his seat, and the professor began to resume his statement. We must trace each of these boxes, and when we are ready, we must either capture or kill this monster in his lair, or we must, so to speak, sterilize the earth, so that no more can seek safety in it. Thus, in the end, we may find him in the form of a man between the hours of noon and sunset, and so engage with him when he is most weak. And now you, Madam Nina. The night is the end until all be well. You are too precious to us to have such a risk. When we part tonight, you no more must question. We shall tell you all in good time. We are men and able to bear. But you must be our star and our hope. You shall act all the more free that you are not in danger, such as we are. All the men, even Jonathan, seemed relieved, but it did not seem to me good that they should have grave danger and perhaps lessen their safety, strength being the best safety, through care of me. But their minds were made up, and though it was a bitter pill for me to swallow, I could say nothing, save to accept their chivalrous care of me. Mr. Morris resumed the discussion. As there is no time to lose, I vote we have a look at this house right now. Time is everything with him, and swift action on our part may save another victim. I own that my heart began to fail me when the time for action came to so close, but I did not say anything, for I had a greater fear that if I appeared as a drag or a hindrance to their work, that might even leave me out of their counsels altogether. They have now gone to Carfax, which means I get into the house. With means to get into the house. Manlike, they told me to go to bed and sleep, as if a woman can sleep when those she loves are in danger. I shall lie down and pretend to sleep, lest Jonathan have anxiety about me when he returns. Dr. Seward's Diary, 1st October, 4 a.m. Just as we were about to leave the house, an urgent message was brought to me from Renfield to know if I would see him at once, as he had something of the uttermost importance to say to me. I told the messenger to say I would attend to his wishes in the morning. I was busy just at the moment. The attendant added, "He seems very important, sir. I have never seen him so eager. I don't know but what, if you don't see him soon, he will have another one of his violent fits." I know the man would not have said this without some cause, so I said, "All right, I'll go now," and I asked the others to wait a minute for me, as I had to go see my patient. "Take me with you, friend John," said Professor. His case in your diary interests me much, and it had bearing, too, now and again, in our case. I should much like to see him, especially when his mind is disturbed. "May I come also?" asked Lord Godalming. "Me too?" asked Quincy Morris. "May I come?" said Harker. I nodded, and we all went down the passage together. We found him in a state of considerable excitement, but far more rational in speech and manner than I had ever seen him. There was an unusual understanding of himself, which, unlike anything I had ever met with in a lunatic, he took it for granted that his reasons would prevail with others entirely sane. We all four went into the room, but none of the others at first said anything. His request was that I would at once release him from the asylum and send him home. This he backed up with arguments regarding his complete recovery, and added his own existing sanity. "I appeal to your friends," he said. "They will perhaps not mind sitting in judgment on my case. By the way, you have not introduced me." I was so much astonished that the oddness of introducing a madman in an asylum did not strike me at the moment, and besides, there was a certain dignity in the man's manner, so much of the habit of equality, that I at once made the introduction. Lord Godalming, Professor Van Helsing, Dr. Quincy Morris of Texas, Mr. Renfield. He shook hands with each of them, saying in turns, "Lord Godalming, I've had the honor of seconding your father at Wyndham. I grieve to know, by your holding of the title, that he is no more. He was a man loved and honored by all who knew him, and in his youth was, I have heard, the inventor of a burnt rum punch, much patronized on Derby night. Mr. Morris, you should be proud of your great state. Its reception to the Union was a precedent which may have far-reaching effects hereafter, when the pole and the tropics may hold alliance to the stars and stripes. The power of treaty may yet prove the vast engine of enlargement, when the Monroe Doctrine takes its true place as a political fable. What shall say men of his pleasure at meeting Van Helsing? Sir, I make no apology for dropping all forms of conventional pretext. When an individual has revolutionized therapeutics by his discovery of the continuous evolution of brain matter, the conventional forms are unfitting, since they would seem to limit him from one of a class. You gentlemen, who by nationality, by heredity, or by possession of natural gifts, are fitted to hold your respective places in the moving world. I take to witness that I am as sane as at least the majority of men who are in full possession of their liberties. And I am sure to you, Dr. Seward, humanitarian and medico-jurist, as well as scientist, will deem it a moral duty to deal with me as one to be considered as under exceptional circumstances. He made this last appeal with a courtly air of conviction which was not without its own charm. I think we were all staggered. For my own part, I was under the conviction, despite my knowledge of the man's character and history, that his reason had been restored. I felt under a strong impulse to tell him that I was satisfied in his sanity and would see the necessary formalities for his release in the morning. I thought it better to wait, however, before making so grave a statement, for of old I knew that sudden changes to which this particular patient was liable. So I contented myself with making a general statement that he appeared to be improving very rapidly, that I would have a longer chat with him in the morning, and would then see that I could do about the direction of meeting his wishes. This did not at all satisfy him, for he said quickly, "But I fear, Dr. Seward, you hardly apprehend my wish. My desire is to go at once, here, now, this very hour, this very moment, if I may. Time presses, and in our implied agreement with the old Scythemen, it is of the essence of our contract. I am sure it is only necessary to put before so admirable a practitioner as Dr. Seward so simple, yet so momentous a wish to ensure its fulfillment." He looked at me keenly, seeing the negative in my face. Turning to the others, scrutinized them closely. Not meeting any sufficient response, he went on. "Is it possible I have erred in my supposition?" "You have," I said frankly, but all the time I felt brutally. There was a considerable pause, then he said slowly, "Then I suppose I must only shift my ground of request. Let me ask for this concession, boon, privilege, what you will. I am content to implore in such a case, not on personal grounds, but for the sake of others. I am not at liberty to give you the whole of my reasons, but you may, I assure you, take it from me, they are good ones, sound and unselfish, and spring from the highest sense of duty. Could you look, sir, into my heart, would you would approve of, to the full statements which animate me. Nay, more, you would count me amongst the best and truest of your friends." Again he looked at us all keenly. I had a growing conviction that this sudden change of his entire intellectual method was yet another form or phase of his madness, and so determined to let him go on a little longer, knowing from experience that he would, like all lunatics, give himself away at the end. Van Helsing was gazing at him with a look of utmost intensity, his bushy eyebrows almost meeting with the fixed concentration of his look. He said to Renfield in a tone which did not surprise me at the time, but only when I thought about it afterwards, for it was one as if addressing an equal, Can you not tell frankly of your real reason for wishing to be free tonight? I will undertake that if you will satisfy even me, a stranger, without prejudice, and with the habit of keeping an open mind, Dr. Seward will give you, at his own risk and on his own responsibility, the privilege you seek. He shook his head sadly, and with a look of poignant regret on his face, the professor went on. Come, sir, bethink yourself. You claim the privilege of reason in the highest degree, since you seek to impress us with your complete reasonableness. You do this, whose sanity we have reason to doubt, since you have not yet released from medical treatment for this very defect. If you will not help us in our effort to choose the wisest course, how can we perform the duty which you yourself put upon us? Be wise and help us. If we can, we shall aid you to achieve your wish. He still shook his head as he said, Dr. Van Helsing, I have nothing to say. Your argument is complete, and if I were free to speak, I should not hesitate a moment, but I am not my own master in the matter. I can only ask that you trust me. If I am refused, the responsibility does not rest with me. I thought it was now time to end the scene, which was becoming comically grave. So I went to the door, simply saying, Come, my friends, we have work to do. Good night. As, however, I got near the door, a new change came over the patient. He moved towards me so quickly, for the moment I feared he was about to take another homicidal attack. My fears, however, were groundless, for he held up his two hands imploringly, and made his petition in a moving manner. As he saw that the very excess of emotion was militating against him, by restoring us to our old relations, he became still more demonstrative. I glanced at Van Helsing, and saw my conviction reflected in his eyes, so I became a little more fixed in my manner, if not more stern, and motioned to him that his efforts were unavailing. I had previously seen something of the same constantly growing excitement in him, which had to make some request of which, at the time, that he had thought much, such, for instance, when he wanted a cat. And I was prepared to see the collapse into the same sullen acquiescence on this occasion. My expectation was not realized, for, when he found that his appeal would not be successful, he got into quite a frantic condition. He threw himself upon his knees, held up his hands, wringing them in plaintive supplication, and poured forth a torrent of entreaty, with the tears rolling down his cheeks, and his whole face and form expressive of the deepest emotion. Let me entreat you, Dr. Seward. Oh, let me implore you. Do let me out of this house at once. Send me away how you will and where you will. Send keepers with me with whips and chains. Let them take me in a straight waistcoat, manacled and leg-ironed, even to a goal. But let me out of this. You don't know what you do by keeping me here. I am speaking from the depths of my heart, of my very soul. You don't know whom you wrong, or how, and I may not tell. Woe is me, I may not tell. By all you hold sacred, by all you hold dear, by your love that is lost, by your hope that lives, for the sake of the Almighty, take me out of this and save my soul from guilt. Can you hear me, man? Can you understand? Will you never learn? Don't you know that I am sane and earnest now? I am no lunatic in a mad fit, but a sane man fighting for his soul. Oh, hear me, hear me. Let me go, let me go, let me go. I thought that the longer this went on, the wilder he would get, and so would bring on a fit. So I took him up by the hand and raised him. Come, I said sternly, no more of this. We've had quite enough already. Get to your bed, and tried to behave more discreetly. He suddenly stopped, looked at me intensely for several moments. Then, without a word, he rose, and moving over, sat down on the side of the bed. The collapse had come, as on the former occasion, just as I expected. When I was leaving the room, the last of our party, he said to me in a quiet, well-bred voice, You will, I trust, Dr. Seward, do me the justice to bear in mind later on that I did what I could to convince you tonight. that, folks, that brings us to the end of Chapter 18, and to the end of tonight's show. Certain aspects of the real world compel us that this will be our only broadcast for Dracula this week, but we will return. I assure you, we will be returning next week to continue our story. Please keep an eye out for other offerings coming from Virus Free Radio. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our minstrel Ryan for adding the ever-present and wonderful ambiance to our harrowing tale. And to all of you out there, until we meet again next week, I wish you all to stay safe and to stay healthy, and to all and to everyone, just be kind. Have a good night.